So hi everyone, my name is Patricia, and I worked, before I started doing JavaScript, which was about a little over a year ago, I worked in restaurants for a really long time. And let's see here. So what happened was when I was like 15 years old, I was wondering, how the hell do you make a cheesecake? I wanted to know what went into a cheesecake. Like, I didn't really understand cream cheese at the time because we didn't really eat cream cheese in my house, so I didn't understand how that happened. And the curiosity in me got the better of me, and I went on to do about every single job in a kitchen and front of the house that you could possibly do. And so when I started doing JavaScript, I noticed a lot of similarities. I noticed a lot of things that we had in common between the workflow of working in a restaurant and working on an engineering team. So what does a chef actually do on a day-to-day basis? Well, obviously they make and serve food all day. Like, that's pretty clear. But that has a lot in common with what we do with engineering, because that's a lot like shipping fast and shipping often. There's also this thing that happens that's really amazing when you work in a restaurant and you work on the line during service, which is like what we call dinner or lunch or whatever. There's this thing that happens, and we call it like the dance, and it's when you're so in tune with all the people that you're working with that you don't even need to really say anything to each other except for the little like signals that you give so that everybody knows what page you're on. And you just move around each other really well. And so working in a kitchen has a lot to do with teamwork. And that really reminded me of agile systems and like synchronized collaboration on tickets and features. And then obviously there's skills that we have, technical skills in a kitchen, knife skills, understanding like different processes like sous vide, and applying those techniques to a recipe is a lot like exercising tech skills within a design pattern. We also write down all of our recipes, otherwise it would be crazy and there wouldn't be any consistency ever when we're working on something in a restaurant, which is kind of bad. You want your Eggs Benedict to come out the same way every time, otherwise people aren't going to come back and eat at your restaurant again. So that's a lot like documentation. And you'll never survive in a kitchen unless you can work clean. Unless you are able to pick up after yourself and keep your station always ready, you will never succeed. It's probably the one thing that is an immediate indicator. And working clean is like one of our mantras, and that reminds me a lot of refactoring. And then obviously, every position in a restaurant is doing hospitality. Every single person, whether it's a cook or the hostess or a dishwasher, they're all doing a job that is basically to serve people. And so the best way to do hospitality is to consider the needs of the people who you're helping out, which is a lot like empathy. So if you look at what a chef does, they kind of do everything that we do as engineers. These are some of the habits of a good chef. And a lot of these things are things that we talk about on a daily basis in the kitchen: a sense of urgency, attention to detail, respecting ingredients. And these are a lot of lessons that I hope that we can pass along to engineers, because restaurants have existed for almost 300 years. And as engineers, we've only worked in this format and agile like structure for less than 30 years. So I feel like there's a lot of fables and mythology that kitchens can pass on to engineers so that they can learn those lessons. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was sense of urgency. This is a quotation from Thomas Keller of the French Laundry, where he's just talking about what it means to produce things. So a sense of urgency doesn't mean just getting it done fast. It doesn't mean that you make something and send it out and it doesn't matter what state it's in. It means that like you are putting so much attention into what you're doing and you are working at like your highest capacity. So you're get to where you can't improve and you can't do any better. It's the best that you've done. That's what every chef asks of their cooks. So they understand that like a cook might not be that fast on one station, but as long as they're doing the best that they can as quickly as they can, that's what matters. And I used to work at this bakery, Huckleberry, and this is the chef, Zoe Nathan. She taught me a really amazing thing, which is if it's not good, don't serve it. Just because we have a case full of pastries every day doesn't mean that we need to fill it and with anything. So, for example, if we made a batch of donuts and they didn't come out right, she would toss the whole batch, and we wouldn't have donuts that day because what mattered was the quality of what we were putting out, and we cared a lot about making sure that our customers really enjoyed the food. And so this was a lesson that I carried through with me to engineering and working on tickets and such. Let's see here. So another thing that's on here that we'll talk a little bit more in detail about is owning mistakes and congratulating the team on success. So one of the things that is really important when you're working in a restaurant is that you keep your highs low and your lows high. If you make a mistake, you own it, you try not to do it again, you do your best to absorb the lesson, and when you're successful, it's not just you that's successful, it's your whole team that's successful. So if one person fails on the team, that means that the whole team failed because you didn't have their back, you didn't step in to help them. Because cooking is a team sport. We're all in this together. And just like that, I believe that coding is a team sport, and that when you work on an engineering team, you need to have each other's back. And if one of the team members is having trouble with a ticket, and you're in the middle of a sprint, and you have time, and you can afford to help them out, it's your responsibility to help them as much as you can. So within a kitchen, we have a hierarchy that we call the Brigade. So people have different levels of expertise on different stations, and you're positioned in a station that you're either trying to learn or that you're really good at, depending on what the team needs. And the system isn't created to get mad at people. It's created it's not there to have a bottom rung or a top rung. It's there so that we can all work synchronized, do synchronized collaboration to work on what we're doing. And being part of that team means that we spend almost 60, 70, 80 hours a week together. Well, if you're working lunch and dinner service 4, 5, 6 days a week, you basically live with these people. So it's really important that you trust each other. Otherwise, bad things can happen. You can get cut, you can get burned. It's a real actual danger, not production data danger. So it's really important that you have a sense of camaraderie, which is why we do this thing called family meal, which is what you see these people in the background doing. We always try to spend an hour before every service sitting down and just taking some time to be a family together. And because we do this, it builds a sense of trust and psychological safety so that people can collaborate better together. And these are some of the other ways that we communicate as our team. The first one, lineup, it's pretty much exactly like stand-up. We all stand around before service and talk about what we need to do. Like if I was behind and I didn't have enough time to juice citrus for service, that's when I would let people know. We also discuss any breaking changes. So if there's a new item on the menu, chef would walk us through what the new item on the menu is. And we'll discuss other new things. We'll do wine tastings, and we'll talk about pairings, and we'll quiz each other. The other thing that we do to communicate really well is blue tape, which is how we label everything. It'd be really gross if you went into the walk-in and you were just like, sure, I don't know when these potatoes were cooked or this garlic was peeled and made confit. I'm just going to use it. That would be really bad. You could, hurt somebody with that food. So it's really important to label everything. And I like to think of that as putting comments in your code when something, needs a little warning, which is also a lot like safety jargon, which we'll get to in a second. So yes, chef, which I'm sure you've heard in the popular jargon, is not just what we say when somebody tells us what to do. It's also an acknowledgement that we've heard the other person. So it's really important. I feel like this is something that's lacking, especially on the engineering teams that I've been involved with, which is that there isn't usually a callback that happens when somebody alerts the team as to what's going on. And oftentimes this means that there will be a mistake made in the future, or somebody won't realize that a change has been made. So it's really important to acknowledge that your coworkers have advised you to do something. In this case, we use yes, chef, just because it's quick and fast, and we like to say chef a lot. Then the other thing is cook time. So when you're on a line, and let's say I'm on the fish station, and you're on the sauce station, and we need to come up together. We need to finish our food at the same time. So we're constantly shouting back and forth to each other our cook times so that we know exactly, so that we're synchronized and we're working together. And safety jargon is words like behind, hot, sharp. These are things that we shout in the kitchen, not because we're mad or like we need to get shit done and we're just like really, really trying to move fast. We say these things because we care about each other and we're trying to protect each other. So if I say behind, that's code for don't move, I'm gonna walk behind you. And I feel like there needs to be more caring like this on engineering teams for our coworkers within our code with comments and documentation and such. So when you do all of these things, when you're able to communicate, this helps build that psychological safety and that trust so that you feel safe enough to say to your boss or your coworker, I have thoughts on this, I would like some feedback, or maybe we need to work on something. And the psychological safety helps when you're working together with somebody because you trust each other to fail together. And failing together is really important because, it's okay to fail. It's totally fine. As long as you're doing it as a team. Because look, he laughs at the end. So, the other thing that we talk a lot about in the kitchen is knife skills and technique and different practices that we use, which is a lot like tech skills, learning the newest framework or learning functional programming versus object-oriented programming. Working with these things seems very trendy, but we've been doing this kind of stuff in our industry for a really long time. We've been debating which practices are best. And I like to think of knife skills as technique, produce, raw product, meats, dairy, that kind of thing. I like to think of those things as languages. Seasoning is like frameworks. Gadgets are like libraries. And you have to practice to develop a palate. You have to practice using all of these things to figure out how much seasoning to put on something. And something that every chef I've known has said, and I like this quotation from David Chang, is that you learn by over-seasoning and under-seasoning. You learn from going too far and then not going far enough. But what you're doing is you're learning how to know what just the right amount is and how to make those adjustments. And let's see here. So the other thing that is important is by developing your palate, you're able to, and by understanding all these things, you're able to mentor people better. And the thing that I've noticed that doesn't happen enough in engineering is we don't tell juniors, or in the case of a restaurant, what we would call a stage, we don't tell them why we do things the way we do them now. We don't tell them why it was so painful to do them the old way in the past. So I think it's a really important thing to explain the pitfalls, to explain why we've changed our patterns to do this new way. And also, as someone who is self-taught, I think it's really important to learn to tap into your imagination and consider food science and CS theory like parallel things. First you learn the how, and then you learn the why. So first you want to learn how to brunoise garlic, and then you learn why we cut it so small. First you learn how to sous vide, and then you learn why you sous vide. So as someone who was self-taught, this was the manner that I felt was most efficient for me, and I think that it's something that we should be a little bit more open to. And this is another reason why it's important to provide context and history. So, unless you tell someone, what this function that was given to us in ES6 was and why it's like so helpful and what the process was in the past, if you don't share with them the past process, they're never really, it's not going to sink in well enough. It's unlike, thinking about, imagine if you had to chop all the vegetables for a pureed soup and you had to chop them and chop them and chop them tinier and tinier and tinier and then pass them through a sieve so that you could make pureed soup. Like, that would really suck. That would take a long time. That's why it's so cool that we have Cuisinarts and RoboCoops and immersion blenders. So the other thing is talking about recipes and documentation. I went really in depth into this at Brooklyn.js, but I want to kind of touch on it really quick, which is that it's important to write docs. They might not be for you, but you could make them for everyone by tapping into the imagination of the reader. So here we're reading a quotation from Ivan Orkin from Ivan Ramen. Like, remember how when you read a recipe, like if you're reading a recipe for mac and cheese and it's telling you about all the Gruyere and all the cheddar that you're going to like melt into your sauce, like you can taste it. You can feel it while you're reading the recipe. You like get excited for it. And I think it would be really great if we started writing our documentation with this in mind so that we tap into the imagination of the reader, explain to them what some of the possibilities are with these tools that you're giving them, show them examples that are interesting and allow them to come up with new ideas. Another important reason for docs that I really like from restaurants is community wealth, So having a community wealth of recipes is really important in the restaurant industry. Like, you don't want to copy your neighbor, but your neighbor's idea might spark an idea in you that no one else would have thought of. And so having documentation is basically just a way to have better community wealth. Something that you might have heard of if you ever watched like a cooking show is mise en place. It means in French, everything in its place. And it's basically most of the prep work that we do when you cook on the line. So all of these little jars down here are like chopped shallots and herbs like parsley, sauces, that kind of things that you need to come up with your food at the last second to fire your food. Let's see here. So, oops, lost my place. So I like to think of mise en place, like usually a chef just has their own mise en place that they work with, but it's all these different ingredients that the whole restaurant uses. And it's a little bit, in terms of the relationship that a cook has with their mise, it's a little bit like a code base. But the challenge for engineers is that we all have to share our mise. So it's really important to work clean, because if you're not working clean, if you're disorganized, if it's messy, you make it more difficult for people that are coming behind you and working in the same spot as you to do their job well. Anthony Bourdain tells this story in Kitchen Confidential about a chef who got really mad at one of their coworkers and would always like put his hand down on the cutting board and pulled up a handful of parsley and like chopped onions and all this gross stuff. And like, you don't want that stuff accidentally landing in your food. That would be really bad. So if you aren't refactoring, if you aren't working clean, then that's when bad stuff happens. When you're being lazy, that's like when disasters can happen and when bugs appear. The other thing too is like, it's important to, if you're aspiring to lead, if you're aspiring to be an architect and you want to be in charge of the code base, like you have to be conscious of the whole scenario. So you have to be extra vigilant. And Thomas Keller was famous at French Laundry for like judging the cooks based on whether or not they ever picked up anything like outside of their station. So in this case, like even just a cigarette butt that's out in the parking lot might seem inconsequential to another employee. They might not realize that it's actually affecting the whole experience. It's kind of like how at Disneyland they have an average time of I think it's 13 minutes to pick up gum off of like the floor in Disneyland or anywhere. Like they have people patrolling all day because it kind of ruins the experience to go to Disneyland and sit down and gum, right? That kind of ruins your day. So being aware of that whole experience is extremely important in a restaurant, and I believe that being aware of the whole, everything that's happening in your code base, like that's how you'll get to own your own restaurant. That's how you'll get to be in charge of the direction that your code base is going in. Treat it like it's yours, and one day it will be. So on hospitality, hospitality is taking care of other people and loving it. It's not just about like making sure that they get what they need. It's about making sure that they had a great time. And Danny Meyer, who runs Union Square Hospitality and Gramercy Tavern and Shake Shack and many, many restaurants that you guys, great restaurants you guys have here in New York, he always talks about the excellence reflex, which is that you need to jump at the opportunity to make things better. So when you're looking at like the way that you're building something, if you think of something that is going to improve the experience of your coworkers or your users, like having this reflex is going to help you in the long run, and it's going to make everybody's experience better. For example, I worked at a restaurant once that was considered itself fine dining, but was mostly about like the glitz and glamour. And they would always over-reserve tables. They would always like take too many reservations. And I was constantly asking them like, hey, can we make a change here? We can't take any more reservations at 7. And they told me like, oh, well, we'll just give them a glass of champagne. We can just send a glass of champagne to the people. But there was never any bottles of champagne like ready to go for people. So that was very frustrating because I wasn't able to empowered to serve the users. But I worked at another place that I helped open that a chef friend of mine ran, and he gave all of the servers autonomy. He gave them autonomy to change someone's reservation around, or to move them to another table, or to provide them with like an amuse-bouche or a taste of port at dessert if they were having a less than great experience. And this takes into account like you have to work on some of these emotional skills to be able to notice when these things need to happen. The other thing that's really important is empathy for your team. So I know that kitchens get a bad rap because there's a lot of yelling that happens, but a lot of that has changed in the last 5-10 years. A lot of chefs are realizing that it's not a great experience for working in for their teams, and they want to retain better cooks, especially now that like there's so much fame that goes along with cooking. So it's really become super important to listen and stop yelling as much and try to be a safe environment for your workers. And this allows for better constructive criticism, which is crucial to working on a better product. Because if you feel like your cook can come to you and say like, hey, I have an idea, I was wondering if we could do this, then you're going to have a better experience and everyone's going to be happier and they're going to want to stay working there. And this comes to an article that was written by Rene Redzepi called Fantasies of a Happier Kitchen, where he discusses these things and he talks about how he thought he was never going to be a chef that would yell at anybody. And then one day he realized he became that when his sous chef called him out and said like, hey, what you did was not cool. And he turned it around and made Noma a much more like quiet environment and made everybody like consider each other and be more generous in their communication. And now he runs a symposium called MAD, which is from the Danish word for food, where they just talk about hospitality. And they basically, like, now they have comps for food. And I really believe in this management style, which is servant leadership that Danny Myers talks about in Setting the Table, which is basically like inverting the pyramid. And think about it as that the managers are there to serve the employees so that the employees can serve the user. So when you turn the pyramid upside down, you're able to allow for your employees to get to your users faster and to help them faster. So fixing bugs and stuff like that. And let's see here. So when you invert the pyramid and when you give your employees autonomy to be able to help the users and to be in touch with them, I think that it helps them be more empathetic towards the user. They consider accessibility issues They consider like what Sarah was talking about yesterday about JavaScript without JavaScript. And at some of the places, I've heard of things where they have the engineers do client service work for a set amount of time every year. And I know that that sounds extremely painful, but it's also like really important to understand the pain that our users are going through so that we can serve them better. So it might sound really awful to have to like listen to somebody on the phone for an hour a month or something, but imagine what it's like to be that person and to be in that position where you have to actually call a number and talk to somebody or deal with an automated system. And so empowering our engineers to like consider these things is really important. And I don't have time to go through these slides, but thank you so much. Sit over here now.
Patricia Realini, ladies and gentlemen.
Like tortellini or linguine or fettuccine.
Yeah. It's the real. 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 Well, that was a real amazing talk. I heard a sort of preview of coming attractions at Brooklyn.js, but it's amazing. How did you get from kitchens to code, right? Like, what was that journey like?
So I actually got a degree in business marketing and art history, and I worked in restaurants to put myself through school, and I really loved working there, but I spent almost 2 years looking for a job after school without being able to find one. And a friend of mine was doing Hack Reactor, and she was showing me the project she was working on, and she was showing me all the possibilities and the fact that like working with code doesn't just mean working with JavaScript, it also means like working within an industry, so you can be writing JavaScript for a museum or for a restaurant or for whatever. And so I tried my hand at it, and it worked out.
Are you working in a capacity sort of like technology serving restaurants right now, or like what sort of work are you doing right now in code?
Personal projects mostly.
Yeah, right on. The metaphors. I love how you like bring these kitchen metaphors in, not knowing much about sort of kitchens and the kitchen industry. And I was jotting some of these down. The yes chef idea, I thought was really powerful. Are you collaborating with a team on your projects now in code? I was wondering, like, thinking about how I could sort of get a yes chef kind of idea into like how I work as a developer. I mean, have you tried this, or like, do you have any tips for us?
So I'm actually doing a talk about chef communication with Juan Pablo Buritica at Web Rebels next week, and it's all going to be about like this kind of stuff. And what we decided on was there's something that they do at Ride, which I really like, that we kind of decided was how we were going to use this metaphor, which is that like not sharing things in Slack, but rather having like an official email, and everyone has to reply back to the email that they got it. Like, it might seem like, you know, oh, I don't want to have all those replies on the email. But if someone confirms that they understand, like, that's your yes chef. And if they don't say anything, then you have to follow up with them and you find out why they didn't understand it, or if they just missed the email. But
yeah, sure. I mean, there could be definitely like some automated things, maybe through Slack or whatever. But I love that concept. So, duh, right? Yeah, I think like those kitchen metaphors are sort of like playing into other aspects of your life. With your talk at Brooklyn and also with this one, I feel like every slide was like a course. It was like so dense, it had a taste. It was fantastic. Do you plan to like get back into restaurants, get back into cooking, or like somewhere in between?
Yeah, another reason why I decided to do coding was also because like they don't really pay you a lot of money when you work in a kitchen. So it's kind of really hard to start your own restaurant when you're making like $10 an hour, maybe plus tips. You know, if you're working in the back of the house, you're not even making tips unless you work at like a super nice place that pools tips with front of the house and back of the house. But like, yeah, I would love to go back and open a pie shop or make pozole or do about 1 million of the things that I got the chance to do.
Amazing. Well, I will definitely be there. Ladies and gentlemen, Patricia Realini, thank you so much.